Thank you so much for joining us on At Issue. My name is H. Wayne Wilson. The federal minimum wage has been at $7.25 since 2009. The state of Illinois has a minimum wage of $8.25. The question now is, having sat at those levels for quite some time, is it time to raise the minimum wage? What is the impact of raising the minimum wage, and how high should it go if it is raised? And to have that discussion, I have with us Dr. Victor Devenatz. Dr. Devenatz is a professor in the College of Business at Illinois State University. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And also with us is Jeff Griffin. Jeff is the president and CEO of the Peoria Area Chamber of Commerce, and as well the president of the CEO Council. But basically, we'll have you just be Chamber of Commerce.
You got it.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you so much for being here. So I mentioned, and I think we probably should set the stage. How much is $7.25 an hour? That's, if you were to work 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, that would be $14,500. In Illinois, 8 1/4 would be $16,500. So that gives you kind of an annual basis for what that is. So the first question should be, what would be a fair minimum wage, and how soon should we get there? And why don't you suggest a dollar amount, if you want to be so bold?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's a dollar amount to suggest, but I think in terms of having a decent minimum wage, it would be something that people feel that they could live on, at least a single person. And on $14,500, you can't live by yourself on that wage. You can't rent a place and own a car, and certainly having children would be difficult.
And does the chamber have a position as to should it be raised?
Right. So we do, to answer your question, yes, along with chambers across central Illinois, have an opposition to a federally mandated or state mandated minimum wage. And I want to draw a clear distinction that is not an opposition to people earning a living wage, but to have government impede upon that and mandate a number for businesses is something we are opposed to.
So you'd prefer there be no minimum wage?
Well, yes. Actually, yeah, there'd be no minimum wage. But to have government involved in anything, from our standpoint, government could mess up a 3-car funeral, all right? So we want the market to determine the wage, and we know we have plenty of independently, privately owned businesses who pay good wages to good employees. So in an ideal world, the bad employers would be weeded out because good employees would not go work for them, and they'd go work for folks paying a decent wage where people could afford a home and afford families and so forth. But minimum wage and living wage are two very separate issues in my mind.
Would having no minimum wage, and by the way, 5 states have no minimum wage, they're all in the South, is that a viable option?
I don't really think having no minimum wage is a viable option, because I think that employers would pay as low as possible, and that there are people who are so desperate who would be willing to work for almost nothing. So I think there has to be some minimum wage for a minimal amount of protection of workers.
Do you share that sentiment that there would be employers who would say, oh, I'm just going to pay the bare minimum because I know someone's going to.
So what the professor said, to have people that want to work that are desperate is something we do not want, okay? I don't want as an American. I find abusive employers to be a rare occasion. Most of the independently owned businesses I know and work with and are part of the 1,100 members of the Chamber of Commerce want good employees, and they want to pay them a wage to keep good employees. I mean, I only have 6 employees at the Chamber of Commerce,
yes.
But they're all young professionals, and I pay them a wage that I hope to keep them,
sure.
and want to continue to do so. It's to me, the abusive employers and the abusive employees on each side are rarities, and to have a minimum wage that protects both is something I'd rather we didn't have.
Well, you mentioned something that I'd like to follow up on,
Yes,
and that
sir.
is independently owned companies.
Mm-hmm.
what makes up your membership? Is it Walmart's or is it
Yeah.
the small 20-person company?
No, so it's a fair question. So we have large businesses that are members of the Chamber of Commerce, including Sam's Club and Walmart's and grocery stores and so forth. But 85% of the Chamber of Commerce members have 25 or fewer employees.
So is it a different argument for them as opposed to a
It
Caterpillar?
very much is so, yes. Well, Caterpillar's a whole nother situation, but if you compared a chain fast food restaurant versus an independently owned local restaurant, to absorb the minimum wage, if, for example, it were $15 an hour, the independently owned restaurant would have far less capacity to provide that wage versus a McDonald's or a Wendy's or a Burger King.
So let's go back to a question I asked earlier that we haven't addressed yet. Is that so? So let's just, for the sake of discussion,
Yeah.
let's say that there already is a minimum wage. I don't think the government's going to retract the minimum wage, so we're going to deal with that. How much should it be to be a fair? I mean, we're talking about a livable wage. We're talking about a minimum wage. What should it be to begin with? Is there some way of determining that so we're fair to the employer and fair to the employee?
Yeah. Well, I think it also depends where you live. Having a minimum wage of $7.25 in Alabama is certainly different than having a minimum wage of $7.25 in San Francisco or New York City. So I think certainly cost of living needs to be taken into account here in terms of determining the minimum wage.
So that's the problem with a federal mandated.
Exactly. So, I mean, you compared, Professor, all due respect, you compared the South to San Francisco, New York City. But I'd compare to Peoria to Chicago. Why would the minimum wage be the same in Peoria as it is in Chicago? We see a tremendous amount. We have 500 members of our Young Professionals group in Peoria, Illinois, because they don't want to pay high rent in Chicago, and they want to live here in central Illinois. But why would those minimum wages be the same?
Now, cities have undertaken efforts.
have.
San Francisco says by 2018 it'll be $15. Chicago is going to go in 3 years to $13.
Right.
So they've taken on their own to say we need to have $13 for Chicago.
Correct, and I think in terms of New York, it's $15 by 2022 that they're planning to raise it to.
So let's say that we come to an agreement on what the minimum wage should be. Maybe there should be a tiered minimum wage. The federal government, by the way, has a tiered, when you want per diem. If your meeting is in San Francisco or it's in Peoria, you get paid two different amounts. The federal government has that in place. So let's say that exists, but can you agree that there should be a cost of living component so that we don't have this discussion in the future, that there be a cost of living adjustment?
No, so we would agree. I think it's a state issue, not a federal issue to begin with. And I mean, as Chamber of Commerce president, all you're going to hear from me is, I don't hate the government, but I don't like them messing with. They're here to protect us and provide fire and safety and all those things, but I want business to operate as business. So I think the state of Illinois, or whatever state, should determine their own minimum wage. And if it's Chicago or San Francisco or New York City want to do their own thing, that's fine, but it shouldn't be blanketed on top of us. But if there were a cost of living associated with that, we could be in agreement with that. But the point is, again, we're back to talking about a minimum wage and a livable wage. You're talking about a high school student and someone out of college, and the professor and I talked before that, before we were on the show. Obviously, I don't think people aspire to be a minimum wage earner. I don't believe that about human beings, and I think we're in agreement on that.
Yes.
But there needs to be enough separation between the minimum wage and the next stage that there's motivation there for the employee.
So you agree that a cost of living, some
Yeah,
reasonable...
it would be good to have a cost of living adjustment. And I'm just concerned if you made it a state issue, though, that there might be some states that say, hey, we don't want to pass any minimum wage, so we'll allow employers to pay anything that they want.
Yeah.
And so at least having a $7.25 minimum wage means that the states can't pay less than that, though many states, of course, as we've mentioned, pay more than that.
So mixed into all of this is the particular circumstances of an individual. If you're a teenager, you're 16 years old, and you want to go to work for a fast food restaurant so you can pay for your car, pay for the gasoline. That's a different situation than the 24-year-old mother of one who is trying to make ends meet and has no benefits. So if you have a blanket, $7.20, whatever the dollar amount is it equal to, say, the 16-year-old and the 24-year-old mother of one should be in the same circumstance and treated the same?
Well, you're certainly right in terms of the 16-year-old doesn't have to pay for rent, doesn't have to pay for food, doesn't have to pay for some of the other things that a 24-year-old single mother would have to pay for. So, I suppose you could, for people 18 or under, you can say maybe there'll be a sub-minimum wage or something, or a different level of minimum wage than somebody who's 18 or over. But of course, there are still people who are older than 18 who are still living with their parents and might not have to pay for rent and might not have to pay for food, too.
Right, so I have a 16-year-old, soon-to-be 16-year-old son, and he is going to pay for his food and his insurance and everything else, and he and I have come to an agreement, and he's going to start at minimum wage at a grocery store, or fast food, or wherever he works. I also know there are jobs available for people that aspire to, and there's all kinds of demographic issues we can get into of why people are impeded from those jobs, but the trades and training locally for the medical field and so forth, those jobs are available. So from our standpoint, from my standpoint, we want to motivate people to get that training so they're out of this whole discussion together. They are earning a livable wage, because the minimum wage increase is not going to increase benefits and things of this nature. True. So you're going to see, I know this sounds like catastrophe stuff, but kiosks to order your hamburgers and so forth. Already some of that's being outsourced to China and India. When you drive up to a fast food restaurant, the voice you're talking to is not a voice inside, it's a voice overseas. So you're going to see more of that. So it's more an issue of motivating our citizenry to be trained so they can have the benefits and enjoy the American dream beyond fast food and working at grocery stores at minimum wage.
I think that's certainly true, but there are going to be certain industries where are near minimum wage or at minimum wage, such as home health care, where even if people get more education as our population ages, we're going to need people to take care of older people generally have more medical problems. So you're still going to have these jobs. These jobs aren't going to totally disappear, these lower level jobs. You're right in terms of the fast food industry that there is some capital substitution now in terms of when costs do increase, they move to other, to substituting machinery for doing some of these things. But I'm not certain in terms of, are we going to be able to do that in home health care?
Yeah.
Have robots take care of people? Well, maybe 100 years from now? I don't know.
Not in our lifetime.
Maybe not in our lifetime.
No, but that's a fantastic example, because what you're talking about is personal service and the relationship of a home health care aide coming to service your family member. But why not have that person motivated to reach the next tier of what that industry provides to them financially? Or if they are paid hourly, they're happy with that because it fits with their lifestyle of being a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad.
But what I'm saying is, I guess there will always be some people who are doing these jobs. And even if we increase the education levels, and I'm for giving people opportunities, we're still going to need competent people to do these jobs. And certainly, the more experience that they have, the better they're going to be. So I don't think we can just have like teenagers do it for 1 or 2 years, for instance, home health care, and then move them out as they go to college and get more education or more skills or go into apprenticeship programs.
We know home health care workers, generally speaking, are, one would assume that they're considered underpaid for the skill level that they bring to the job, whereas a McDonald's worker doesn't bring a lot of skill to the job. So here we are in the situation of life is unfair.
I've learned that.
You learned that finally? So to mandate a particular level for everybody, does that seem fair when you have these different scenarios?
Well, I think once more, minimum wage sets a floor. And, my concern is if there was no floor, how many employers would pay below the minimum wage? I mean, we were talking about before some statistics that you said, when we were talking before, that there are people making below the minimum wage. And you said, how is that possible? Well, there certainly is illegal employment going on and different kinds of payment arrangements, which the Department of Labor does find, each year that goes on. So my concern is if there was no minimum wage, how many more employers would be paying such low wages?
And honestly, I don't have a similar pessimism of employers. For example, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to qualify that as pessimism, but I think that's where the arguments differ, because I believe in the human spirit wants to advance itself, and a minimum wage to me creates a minimum standard that people won't aspire past. And so, I mean, we've got now compression issues with salaries and so forth. I mean, the unions, for example, bring up the unions. The unions are partners with the Chamber of Commerce. We don't always agree on every topic, right? But if you're going to start an apprenticeship program, and I'm throwing out numbers, $15 to $18 to $19 an hour, you're going to invest 3 to 4 years of your life to be an apprentice before you earn a better wage as an electrician or so forth. But that's so close to a $15 an hour minimum wage that you're going to pay somebody to serve up a Big Mac. It just does not feel, it doesn't feel right to the way I see the business community.
I mean, I think that in terms of if we look at wages, in terms of the past 40 years, real wages have gone down. And they've gone down by about 25%, meaning the buying power. Now, this is not consistent across certainly, college level people who have a college level of education or more. They've made some, certainly where we see the most growth is in certain industries like finance, certainly the top, 1%ers or even, a fraction of 1%. But real wages have been going down since 1973. So that's a concern, even if we're looking at wages beyond the minimum wage. They're not necessarily unproblematic.
But is that a minimum wage issue or a housing industry issue, an oil industry issue? Because I agree. I mean, I'm 45 years old. I've felt that in my 401k and everything else.
Sure.
My wife and I have lived for in the last 20 years. I don't believe that that's solved by the minimum wage.
Well, I guess, my point is if there was no minimum wage, how much worse could it be? And once more, this would be an empirical question. We'd have to wait and see and actually do studies to see how many more employers would be paying below the minimum wage. Certainly, I mean, unemployment now is about 5%. And that's considered pretty good now. But if we look at, 40 years ago, 5% was not, what good unemployment was. The good level would be like, under 4%. But I don't think we're going to go see a level of unemployment as low as we've seen before. So with higher levels of unemployment and more people looking for jobs, employers could pay less money to people because there's more people looking for jobs.
And you mentioned the issue of compression of salaries. We've seen it in the journalism industry. And so a person coming out of a four-year university with a degree would make less than $30,000 as a reporter, would make less than $30,000 a year, and a minimum wage of $15 would be $30,000.
Correct.
And so we start to see inequities here. Why go to college? There's all sorts of tangential issues here that can occur.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely true. I mean, I think I'm repeating myself, but I believe people, a journalist, for example, no one goes to journalism school to become rich. They love to.
We knew that going in. I knew that going in.
But they love. I mean, I have a bachelor's in criminology and social work, and you love the work you do, right, as a journalist. So you should be fairly compensated and should be able to have some children and own a home and so forth. But if you have the folks eking into the labor market at $15 an hour, what's the motivation to become a tradesman or a journalist or to make that investment towards your future?
But I even believe that if there was upward pressure on the minimum wage, there would be upward pressure in terms of other wages. So it's not like, for instance, that all other wages would stay the same. I believe that they would also be, moved up too.
So that's where the professor and I would have a complete disagreement, gentlemanly disagreement. When I see the city of Peoria, for example, we'll use that as an example, $1 million per year, their budget goes up because of state mandated pensions. The fire chief, I'm using that as an example, police chief, the management, they cannot promote that person to a level high enough to keep up with minimal level to come in for very hardworking firefighters and police officers. But the compression issues between management and an hourly wage, it breaks down. And that's not just Illinois, that's the United States of America. And Illinois is worse than the other states, but it is a very significant issue.
So let me talk a little bit about the buying power of the minimum wage. The minimum wage was instituted back in the 1930s. It was 25 cents an hour.
1938 it was implemented. It was 25 cents an hour, correct.
And what was the high point for value of the minimum wage? Do we know that?
Yeah, the high point for value was in 1968 was $1.60 an hour, which in 2016 dollars would be $11.16 an hour. So, and compare that to the federal minimum wage of $7.25. So $11.16 is almost $4 an hour more. And that would be the minimum wage buying power from 1968.
So, in understanding that there's difference in cost of living in different markets and a lot of other things we've already discussed, but shouldn't there be some fairness in bringing that minimum wage up to some level? Maybe it's not $15.
Right.
Assuming that we should have a minimum wage. I know that you think there shouldn't be one at all, but
I'm speaking more as Jeff Griffin, Chamber of Commerce, because we have with 65,000 employees, there's a lot of different opinions in the chamber. Yes, I've already conceded there should be a level that allows people to keep up with the cost of living. The year-to-year comparison or the history of the minimum wage in our country, that's debatable on another show maybe. But to double it or nearly double it just seems incomprehensible.
Yeah, but I think in terms of doubling it, it's not going to double overnight. Go from $7.25 to 2015 all of a sudden in 1 month or in 1 year, right?
No, but even if you look at a capacity for locally owned restaurants, I'm not going to name them but you have so Peoria is a community that has a lot of independently owned businesses. The burden on their back is going to be enormous, and the quantification of that is something beyond the federal statistics. And I just wish the federal government and state government would stay out of private business issues, because I believe in people, and I believe people are going to be attracted to good employers. And they're able to pay a better wage. We want that to happen, but not to be a mandate.
Well, I believe people will be attracted to better employers if they have an option, right? I mean, if unemployment is high and people can't get jobs, somebody's going to usually take a job rather than no job. Though, of course, depending on their other options that they do have, if they could get disability, right, as unemployment goes up, we know that more people file for disability, et cetera, and, more people then also are likely to retire earlier if they can't get jobs, to take Social Security, et cetera, because you can take it as early as 62. So it really depends what their options are. I agree with you that people are going to be attracted to better employers if they have those options.
Real quickly, one issue that we haven't addressed is many people that are on minimum wage or near minimum wage aren't working 40 hours a week to begin with. They don't have benefits. They may be in a situation where they are a secondary wage earner and they just do it to kind of enhance family income. Some may be working 2 or 3 part-time jobs to do that. So there's a lot of variables here that it is difficult to account for every single situation. So how do you go about saying, well, for this person who really needs it, but this person who's just working for auxiliary income?
Well, I mean, that You're right. There are many different situations, and we can't, adjust wages for each person in terms of for each of their situations. But I still think that there needs to be at least some kind of floor. That's my feeling,
Yeah.
And there have been countries, for instance, that have gotten rid of the minimum wage, but then have brought them back because there were some of these problems that did occur.
I don't think there's any disagreement with that. I mean, there are. My wife got fired this week from her teacher's aide job, and she could be employed higher than a teacher's aide. Not taking nothing away from teachers' aides, but it fits with our lifestyle of kids right now, and summer's off, and home for homework, and these sort of things. And she'll be reemployed next year based on her performance.
So with that, we have come to no conclusions whatsoever, but we hope we've offered you some sort of background as to the difficulty involved in whether or not there should be a minimum wage, what it should be, and how it should be applied maybe to different people. So we'll have to continue the conversation after the cameras shut down. But for now, we'll say thank you for enjoying another season of At Issue. We'll be back in a month or two with the 29th season of At Issue. We'll see you then. Thanks for joining us.